want to thank everybody for joining us. We're going to get this thing, going. We're going to be talking about a conversation that really needs to be had, which is thinking about the Trump presidency and what it's really meant for education policy. You know, obviously, as we transition from the Biden administration into the Trump administration, in what has become an unprecedented transition, to say the least. And now we can begin to reflect on, kind of where we are. And so, Professor Ken Wong, my colleague, my esteemed colleague, will lead us in a discussion around a component of a book that he co-wrote around this topic, or really around this sort of larger idea of federalism, and how the sort of Trump administration has leveraged or exploited federalism, sort of depending on your take. Putting bias on table, I'm in the latter camp. And what I want to do is just for a second talk about why, this sort of federalism, what this federalism problem sort of means. And I think Professor Wong will get more in depth with this, and why we should be really concerned. And so, as Professor Wong talks about in this text, and as he'll probably talk about in this presentation, America's education system is unique because of our federalist structure, right? We have this conglomerate of states, and sort of by virtue of the way in which our Constitution is written, a lot of the sort of legal discretion around how schools operate gets kicked to the states, and a lot of states decide to kick power to school districts, and we have what is kind of considered local control, but with huge state intervention that could vary across states. What this means is that we're sort of unique for countries that have more centralized education systems. Right? If you go to a country like, for instance, if you go to Mexico or even Canada, you'll find a more centralized structure where what happens in, whether it's the federal legislature or what happens with the prime minister or the president, these things have more direct impact for what the education system looks like sort of nationally. We don't have that in the US. We have this federalist system that provides, checks and balances and sort of hurdles that people must jump through, especially the president in and of her or himself, in order to change the structure of what our education system looks like. The interesting thing that's been happening is there are certain levers that can be pulled. And education is one of those areas where we see levers pulled, but it doesn't quite get the amount of attention that it gets in other areas. One interesting thing that you'll notice in the sort of modern history of education policy is the bipartisan nature of federal policy. And this bipartisan nature of federal policy lends itself to the ability of the president to have quite a bit of a say in terms of like just sort of charting the overall narrative that we take with education policy. What is unique, one of the things that's been unique about the Trump presidency, as Professor Wong will go into more depth about, is the use of the executive order. And the executive order is really interesting because the only check on the executive order is the Supreme Court. Well, and in addition to the Supreme Court, it's the change in the president. And so, we'll end this conversation with discussion about the importance of the Biden administration and what to expect. And I think one of the things that we'll sort of key in on is the overall idea that I want to enter this conversation with, which is the idea that when it comes to education, although it might not seem like it's the case, presidents matter quite a bit. Who sits in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue does, even though structurally, legally, from the federalist structure, it might seem like it's not the most important sort of pressing political actor. The president actually has quite a bit of say in determining just overall sort of larger narrative and what we pursue in terms of education. And this is K through 12, but this is also, and especially, higher education. Many of us depend on things like Pell Grants and federal investments in higher education in order to have access to colleges and universities that are important for mobility. And when we have federalist structures that don't necessarily invest in higher education, especially in a more uniform way, we feel the effects of this. And so I'll shut up and I'll transition to Professor Wong, but I want to sort of set the table with our understanding that when it comes to education policy and politics, the presidency really, really matters. And again, and we want to understand that it particularly matters in the specific moment where we've had racial injustice, unrest, we've had concerns about climate change. We've had a global pandemic and a pandemic in which we, the U.S., have led the way in an unfortunate way. And so all of these things are sort of swirling in the background as we really take a close dive into what education politics and policy has looked like under the Trump administration. And I'm hoping that you'll find this to be a very enlightening conversation, because there is quite a bit to unearth. And so with that, I will transition to Professor Wong.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks for setting up the larger conversation so nicely. And I think you made some very important observations. Number one is that we have a federal system of education governance. But number two, the presidential power is immense and enormous, and is going to shape and redefine the policy agenda, particularly in addressing systemic racism, as well as opportunities and opportunities for immigrant population in the future. So we are at a very critical moment right now. So what I will do is to share with you what we learned about the Trump administration's use of executive and other administrative tools to change the direction of education policy, particularly in the area of education equality, since they took over in January 2017, and then how they have reversed a lot of the Obama administration initiatives. And now, the interesting thing that Jonathan mentioned is that we are now at a historic moment where we can now treat the Trump administration as a baseline when we go into the next, the president-elect and vice president-elect, the new administration in January 2021. And so this is, in a way, a very important set of understanding when we move into the new administration. What we would expect that the new administration will be leading the nation, and how they would craft the policy tools and the initiatives to, so to speak, undo what has occurred in the last 4 years. So I'm going to quickly share the screen, and we'll start with this conversation. And so this is a book that I co-author, as Jonathan mentioned, that I co-author with two of my colleagues in political science, Professor Frank Thompson, who is a healthcare expert, and Professor Barry Ray, who is an environmental policy, climate change expert in U of Michigan. And my part is focusing on higher as well as K-12 education in this research project. And one thing that I want to mention is that we are not only looking at the Trump administration administrative initiative, but also how those initiatives meet federalism. That is, how do state and local jurisdictions react to the Trump administrative initiative. And the larger concept that we bringing in is the notion that there has been a rise of administrative presidency over the years. The earlier ones, historically speaking, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, right? And then all the way to President Eisenhower, who federalized National Guard in Arkansas for school integration, racial integration. And then when Nixon tried to expand the White House staff, empowering the Chief of Staff office and all the administrative tools, and then all the way into the Reagan administration, where they set up the kitchen cabinet, the three key leaders within the kitchen cabinet that make a lot of important administrative and executive decisions. And into Obama administration, where President Obama used quite a bit of waivers. If you recall, the No Child Left Behind Act was kind of expiring. And so Secretary Arne Duncan used the as well as President Obama, encouraged the state to apply for waivers. And so they used waivers to incentivize state policy changes, for example, Race to the Top, and as well as other innovative initiatives. And now into the Trump administration, the way that we look at how Trump uses the administrative presidency is that he and his team would focus on the high salient policy priorities that the previous administration introduced. And so what we learn is that the Obama administration has introduced and adopted with the support from the Congress, the ACA, what we call the Obamacare Act. And in the climate change, the Obama administration also tried to be more engaging in multilateral international collaboration through the Paris Accord. And in education, we had the bipartisan, as Jonathan mentioned, adoption of the ESSA, the Every Student Succeed Act, back in 2015. And so there have been some key legislative bipartisan initiatives going into healthcare, environmental policy, climate change policy, as well as education. So that kind of motivated all three of us to collaborate on this book. And in this book, we asked the question, what were the instruments being used by the Trump administration to push for the Trump's own agenda in a unilateral way that kind of bypass the Congress as well as bypass whatever coalition that is out there. And the second is that what kind of an effects do they have on the state and local policy areas? And the third is what do we learn about the lessons in terms of the use of administrative and executive actions? Does it undermine checks and balances? Does it raise some new question on democracy? And what has been the role of forces of federalism in addressing this kind of initiatives? So at the very end of the book, I drafted this framework and shared with my colleagues, that Frank and Barry, and they agree that this is quite helpful in understanding and creating kind of an overall overarching framework that tie the comparative policy approach that we had. And that is that some of the administrative actions from the Trump's White House would place tremendous constraint on state and local initiatives, whereas other executive actions would empower, would respect state rights. But at the same time, the Trump's agenda seems to be more radical to the extent that we characterize as sabotage or really radically hostile takeover and search and destroy some of the Obama initiatives in the area of healthcare and in the area of climate change. Whereas in education seems to be more modest compared to healthcare and climate change policy. In education, we can further disaggregate it between higher education and K-12 education. In the case of higher education, we see that Trump's executive power has been used to restrict what the state can do to promote oversight of for-profit institutions in higher education. And we also learned that the Trump administration also tried to provide more rigid guidance in terms of what the state and local districts should do in handling cases of sexual misconduct. But on the other hand, when it gets to K-12, what we learn is that the Trump administration tried to push state rights to an even more deference level. So it's almost like permissive hands-off approach to K-12 and let the states handle all the civil rights issues, including the rights for transgender students, the opportunities to learn for students with disabilities, as well as other civil rights issues. And I will go to some details in the next few slides. So if you look at the Trump administration education policy, we decided not to only focus on executive orders, even though executive orders have attracted the most attention, because if we look at all the administrative tools and instruments, there is a wide-ranging set of guidance and proclamations. For example, a lot of the charter school initiatives came through the proclamations. There are policy letters, there are dear colleagues letters, memorandum, and all kinds of platforms and policy memos, internal as well as external, that we have uncovered in this research. In education, I just want to call attention to the very important executive order issued in April 2017 that prohibited federal infringement on state and local control in a wide range in almost all the education issues. And the executive order also empowers Secretary DeVos to actually conduct a comprehensive analysis and recommendation on what to dismantle in terms of federal involvement. So in education, in this book, we identify that the Trump administration's main strategy has been to rescind, to withdraw, to dismantle, to eliminate some of the guidance that were issued by the Obama administration. And here are some of the examples. Example number one is OCR data collection. Since 1968, Office for Civil Rights have been collecting a whole bunch of data, particularly at the disaggregated level on race, gender, disability, English learners, and so on a wide range of issues, including AP examinations and so on. But as a result of the OCR deregulation, there were critical data elements that are no longer required to be part of this database. And so that's one example of reversal of what the Obama administration has been doing into the Trump administration. Another example is scaling back of civil rights enforcement. We found that the Trump administration eliminated or dismantled 72 guidance documents that clarify student rights under IDEA, student with learning disabilities, and including information for parents on the use of local use of federal IDEA money. There has been a reversal in oversight of campus sexual misconduct. There have been settlement or cases being closed in a huge number. 17,797 cases were closed just in 2017 alone, mainly because of a major departure of the Trump administration unilaterally departing from systemic investigation of racism and discrimination. And that's a major departure from the Trump administration. And I just went through some new documents, even as of spring 2020, Trump administration and the Department of Justice continue to issue new guidelines to empower state discretion on civil rights enforcement. Another example is weakening of federal oversight. And a key example, particularly pertaining to ESEA Title I, ESSA Title I program, that is programs for the low-income schools, high concentrated poverty. This is called a supplement non-supplant regulation. And since 1969, this is a very important oversight guidance that the federal government requires state and local agencies to comply with, that they are using federal dollars not to supplant local and state funding in high need schools. And the U.S. Department of Education now have broadened the definition and empower more flexibility at the local and state level so that they would exercise their own discretion in terms of, they could create broad aggregation of classes of schools that they could justify to receive federal dollars. And then they could also use broad classification of eligibly funded activities to justify why they are using the federal dollars to support their local and state priorities. And of course, the Obama administration also withdrew from the Obama rule on strengthening consumer protections on student loan borrowers, even when, and maybe I should say particularly when, there have been fraudulent private practices in an for-profit provider sector. And so, for example, they basically eliminated the MOU, the data sharing agreement with the consumer protection agencies, so that it makes it a little bit more difficult to track the businesses that practice fraud, as opposed to those loan borrowers who enroll in those programs. It makes it a lot more difficult to track those data. And finally, what we found is deference to stay on ESSA. So when we look at the data at the time, it was 3.5 years into full implementation of ESSA. And now we are into the 5th year, but when we look at the data, and even after 3-4 years of implementation, 80% of the states did not provide disaggregated data in major subpopulation categories, such as low income, English learners, and gender. The state also enjoy tremendous legislative discretion in identifying school improvement strategies that work for them, but the Trump administration further empowered them to exercise their discretion in that whole area. And so what does that come to after 3-4 years of Trump administration? What we found is that despite all the claims from the US Department of Education and the Trump White House, we did not see any major education legislation or initiatives coming out from the Trump administration. However, through those executive instruments and administrative process and litigation and so on, Trump administration was able to lay a groundwork for potentially significant further departure from the Obama policy baseline that they inherited back in 2017. So imagine if we have a second Trump term, I would imagine that the role of the federal government will be further eroded beyond the point of return, and that there will be significant departure from any initiatives that would protect consumers' rights on the part of student borrowers, as well as civil rights enforcement. And clearly, if we were going to have a second term of Trump administration, clearly systemic racism is not going to be a key focus, given the fact that they have dismantled some of the data, OCR data collection element, as well as some of the oversight, traditionally the responsibility of the federal government. But then having put that picture, I would also like to add that what we learn is that federalism matters, even during the Trump years. That is, even when you have a very aggressive unilateral set of actions coming from the Trump White House, federalism, the forces of federalism can push back a little bit. And the next couple of slides will articulate that finding. So what we learn is that one of our colleague, political scientist John Kincaid, would argue that from a governing perspective, you not only need to worry about the national election of a new president, which is very important, critical, but at the same time, there are also a whole bunch of state and local elections. And so sometimes when one party loses the presidential election, that party might be able to use the consolation prize, meaning that they will be able to gain control at the state level. And that's exactly what we are seeing here. So even when the Trump administration was in charge of the White House, we've got the Democratic governors, we've got Democratic elected lieutenant governor, we've got Democratic secretary of state and attorney generals and so on, and legislature, that kind of created some resistance. And to the extent that, particularly during the first 2 years of the Trump administration, if you recall, the House was, both the House and the Senate were very supportive of the Trump agenda. And then the midterm 2018 midterm election then, turned the House back into Democratic control. But during the first 2 years, there were hardly any checks and balances, putting a check on Trump's policy. So the state level created this potential sources of policy and political resistance to the Trump first couple of years. And so that's one set of potential sources of checks and balances at the state level that's come from the governor and the legislature. But what we also found is that the state attorneys general have growingly played a critical role in this dynamic between administrative presidency and federalism. And part of that is because in the last 20 years or so, the state attorneys general have started to organize among themselves. So we have now the Association of the Democratic State Attorneys General, and then we also have an association, National Association of the Republican States Attorneys General. And also in the last 20 years, judiciary has allowed the federal district court to start exercising this power of putting a stop to some of the federal initiative if the state, make a compelling argument. So it opens up the potential and the opportunities for state attorney general's office to actually mobilize their legal argument to either support or against. So we already see that the state of California's state attorney general led the charge to protect the Obamacare Act numerous times. And then we also see that the Texas state attorney general is now supporting Trump to revisit this whole kind of the electoral outcomes in a number of states. And so in this case of education, what we learn is that on a case in terms of protecting the rights of the transgender student, the state attorneys have gotten together, Democratic state attorneys have gotten together to file to support the lawsuit to protect that right. And then in the case of the student borrowers, there have been a coalition of state attorneys generals that also challenged the Trump administration. And the interesting thing about that case is that the federal court has sided with the state attorneys general and the plaintiffs, the student borrowers, in part because they found that the Trump administration did not do a good job in putting together the evidence. And that is grounded in the 1946 Administrative Procedure Act. And that is a very important tool, legislative tool that came out loud and clear in the last few years. And a lot of the Trump executive orders and administrative unilateral actions were pushed back on the ground that they did not do a compelling rationale, and that they took a more arbitrary process in making their case. So this 1946 APA Act turned out to be an extremely important tool. Finally, what does that lead us to? So we learned the baseline. So the Trump administration, 4 years, created this institutional policy baseline for us to move into the next administration. I think the Biden-Harris administration is going to do a number of things. As expected, using executive tools and administrative actions, I think the new administration is likely to strengthen enforcement of systemic justice, civil rights, and student rights, and also protect the student consumers and student borrowers, particularly in the for-profit sector. But perhaps more importantly, or equally important, is that with congressional support, and that's why I think the Georgia election is extremely critical in January, because with full House as well as Senate support, the Biden-Harris administration will be able to push education agenda further. Here are some examples. Jonathan just talked about Pell Grants, and I would add to that federal investment to promote social, racial, and economic equality in the form of expansion of Pell Grants, tuition-free community college, like the Promise program that we have in Rhode Island, HBCU, HSIs, Hispanic serving institutions, tribal colleges, and so on. So that's one bucket of potential growth. Second one is investing in infrastructure. And I think COVID-19 remote learning reminds us the digital gap that we have. And I think the Biden-Harris administration is going to address that gap. And the third area is human capital. And here we might be looking at reauthorization of Higher Education Act. This is a very tough political coalition that the Biden-Harris administration would have to construct. And I think this reauthorization of Higher Education Act will address STEM education, teacher education, new trainings for the green economy and immigration reform. And going downstream, maybe in the third year, fourth year of the Biden-Harris administration, we'll be seeing reauthorization discussion on ESSA. And that's a very important initiative of the Congress. And finally, I am already sensing the new team is going to have a more collaborative working relationship, a partnership with state and districts, and also a more engaging stakeholder process, particularly among diverse voices, unions, racial, ethnic, income groups, LGBTQ groups, businesses, mayors, as well as higher education. So here is a little bit more information on my book, and here is the book in hard copy. So I'm going to show you that there is indeed, this is not only digital, but this is real. And so I welcome any comments and suggestions. I know that Jonathan is going to share with us some of his perspective in the next few minutes on the Biden-Harris administration and education policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wong, for that very, very informative and insightful presentation. What I want to do too is, just add a few, add a few comments that I think just kind of, hit you over the head with what Professor Wong has been talking about, and it is again transition to a little bit of a conversation about Biden-Harris. I'm sorry, probably a Freudian slip there, and from there we'll just take some questions. One of the things I think, the sum to take away here is that, if you can characterize, one way to characterize the Trump administration when it comes to education policy is strategic inaction, right? And you can see the strategicness sort of coming out from the fact that, look, Trump enters the presidency with unified government. So meaning that the Republican Party has the presidency and both chambers of Congress. Yet we see major inaction when it comes to federal policy in terms of education. This is pretty unprecedented given the fact that the last time during the previous iterations where we've seen massive federal policy changes, it's come from divided government, right? Bipartisan bills are being signed into law. Here's an opportunity where a president has campaign promises about what education is supposed to look like, and doesn't deliver. And why? This is strategic inaction. And if you sort of start to dissect everything that Professor Wong is showing us about what the Trump administration was practicing, everything is clandestine, everything is secretive. everything is meant to be in-house. Everything is even not only just meant to be sort of guided, disguised from the public, but even disguised from Congress. And again, it's consistent with this theme of not being sort of attentive to, careful of, and respectful of the sort of normal democratic institutions of American democracy. And so what does this result in? What is this policy of strategic inaction and sort of secrecy, amount to? And a few things that I think are really important, and Professor Wong is hitting on this, but I'm just going to sort of again, sort of reiterate some things here. Easier for charter schools to get federal support. Easier for private schools, significantly easier for private schools to get federal support, especially religious private schools. Harder for LEAs, local education agencies, to engage in internal improvement, right? Much more reliant on state and federal guidelines for improvement, as opposed to a lot of the internal opportunities for improvement that had been sort of put in place under the Obama administration. Harder to have the federal backing when students face physical and especially structural discrimination, right? So when a student, a Black student, a Latinx student, a student that identifies as LGBTQIA+, has some sort of discriminatory issue that happens on the campus, the federal government is supposed to be in place to provide some sort of protection. You should be able to file a claim with the Civil Rights Office and be able to get some sort of direct response to ensure that you're protected. This office has been significantly reeled back, which drastically decreases the probability of being able to get a response from Washington. Easier access to guns in schools. This was one of the lack of response or resistance to the Janus ruling, which significantly weakened the power of teachers unions, well, unions broadly, but teachers unions also. And now the only path is really sort of state mobilization. So what could have happened is the Trump administration comes in and at least it expresses vocal opposition to the Janus ruling, which can help reset a precedent that union power should be sort of strengthened or at least protected. None of this happened. And then ultimately what this results in is the fact that if you're a kid on a campus and you're feeling unprotected and you feel you're not feeling heard, you're not feeling seen, you're feeling like the school, whether it's the teachers, whether it's fellow students, whether it's the district, whether it's the standards, if you feel like these things and or actors are put in place to get in your way and prevent you from getting a quality education, there is essentially nowhere to turn. The federal government should be the place for you to turn when your individual rights are being violated. And what we've seen from the administration, from the Trump administration, is a sheer lack of concern, especially for students who face discrimination on the basis of race, gender, sexuality. This is the fundamental concern, this is the fundamental problem, and this is what we are looking for in terms of a fundamental change heading into the Biden-Harris administration. Bolstering the Civil Rights Office, being more sort of responsive to complaints that are being filed, instances of discrimination and bias, more support for traditional public schools. These are the promises that are on the table, and we'll see if those are delivered over the next 4, possibly 8 years. With that, we'll take questions.
David has a hand up. David.
Oh, yes. Dr. Wong, thank you so much. I want to begin by just prefacing, and I want to say that, like Dr. Collins, I'm biased. I have very negative feelings towards what has taken place because of the Trump actions and under Secretary DeVos. But I want to say that as a school teacher, I have not experienced any significant or meaningful day-to-day impact under the Trump administration that I didn't already feel because of Arne Duncan. And, you know, I teach in Central Falls. As you know, it's an urban district. And so we're still underfunded. We're still teaching under duress. We're still teaching understaffed. We still have this push, both locally and nationally, for this banking style of education where we have hyper segregation of children with special needs, because what is happening is the charter schools have continuously, some charter schools, let me preface that, some charter schools continue to be hyper selective. And so the IEP numbers are in the low 6-7%, while the traditional public schools is in the 25-30%. And so I'm wondering if you have any data about local impact of the Trump administration that I have not noticed on my day-to-day basis.
Jonathan, do you want me to?
Any data on how it's had an impact on the day-to-day basis? Well, I was actually trying to find this again. I remember reading a report from the Civil Rights Office that shows the declining number of complaints over the past few years. In terms of things that have an effect on the classroom per se, data points is difficult because like what we've seen, again, it's the strategic inaction. So with the Trump administration, it's more about what they haven't done as opposed to sort of what they have done. And so like when you think about it from the perspective of, here are the things that I need in my classroom to be successful. I need additional resources and sort of steered to my school so that we can decrease the teacher to student ratio. I need easier access to supplemental resources that can help me sort of be more effective as an instructor. Now it's harder for me to get these things because one, there wasn't a narrative coming from the presidency to suggest that like, okay, we need to be attentive to like fixing these problems. And as a result, we also don't have a national conversation. So like when you look at the literature, the literature on the presidency, the big three things that kind of stand out are the president's use of public appeals and persuasion, and the only sort of more so the resource focused use of the presidency tends to be around like the strategic use of funds and resources. So for instance, this is it's Doug Kreiner at Cornell who writes about this. And one of the things that he looks at is like over time, if you look at the allocation of funds to start military bases in specific locations around the country, it typically is tied to presidents going up for re-election and looking to secure benefits for their own sort of party and their electoral base, right? And so like this type of strategic action is the thing that we typically see when it comes to presidents and federal policy. Again, what we've seen with Trump has been like strategic inaction.
I completely agree. And I think he's a horrible person, and he's done horrible things for people that look like you and I, and for my students. I know that I've had to physically hold students that have broken down because of things that Trump has said and done. But what I'm saying to you is that my experience as a teacher did not improve, or actually was reduced, right, because that damage was already done by Artie Duncan and that style. So I'm really hopeful that what you said later in your short description, that we do have a place to move. But the damage was not started by Trump, is I guess what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that's absolutely. Oh, go ahead, Ken.
Yeah. I think David, you identify some very important systemic challenges, and we do need a systemic solution or strategy. And so far, over the last, for a long time, we have not put on our systemic thinking. So we need to really think about mental health, multilingual learners, this investment in our infrastructure, not only physical but digital, right? And teacher quality and teacher training. So those are some of the really fundamental systemic components. And I'm very hopeful that the Biden Harris administration is going to move right into a systemic approach because of all the movement and the unrest that we've been seeing. The Black Lives Matter movement has already inspired quite a number of policy coalitions to really push this envelope forward. And I think the appointments so far that the Biden-Harris team has made gave me some early signals that they are trying to cross-fertilize, to connect, education and life chances, income equality, and public health safety. They are going to think in a different way than just piecemeal and incrementalism. So that gives me some hope that we will be looking at a very serious systemic conversation to address some of these issues that you raise.
Sue, do you have a question?
Hi, Sue.
Hi, Ken. How are you?
Hey, good.
Good.
Thanks
I
for
want to
coming.
thank both you and Jonathan for your really thought-provoking remarks and for your research. Ken, you talked about, on the one hand, the power of the presidency and executive orders, et cetera, and then on the other hand, the power of states to hold back some of those efforts. And so when you look at the results of the recent election, while the administration, the presidential administration changed, which I am extraordinarily happy about, parties didn't so much shift at the state level. And so I'm wondering about what, and the Senate is yet to be seen, and in the House, Democrats actually lost a little ground.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering about, as you and Jonathan talk about the changes we hope to see via the Biden-Harris administration, what do you predict is going to happen on the state side? Because that state ability to, whether you consider it undermining or thoughtfully controlling the executive action, is still going to be there.
Yes, that's a very important question. So in January 2021, the Biden-Harris administration on day one will face 26 Republican governors and 60% of the legislatures are one-party dominant. So that's what they are getting into. And that conversation has not started yet because they are busy with the more of the federal appointment and the federal level. But I think federalism really creates both sides of the checks and balances. On the one hand, you've got Republican governors and one-party Republican dominance in some of the legislature. They are going to push back on some of the Biden-Harris initiatives. And David will just talk about the importance of systemic redesign. And I think they're going to push back on some of the, for example, one of the highly contested area would be whether we can use federal dollars for diversity training. And the Trump administration just issued this executive order to say, no, we cannot use federal dollars for diversity training. That will go away. But then when it gets to the state level, whether they are going to come up with their own executive legislation initiative on diversity training, use of state funds and federal funds is a different story in those states. But at the same time, you also have the 24 states that have Democratic governors and the 40% of the states that have some degree of Democratic control in the legislature. And that's where we will be seeing some tension between those two coalitions of states to create some checks and balances on the Biden administration. Now, the policy implications that I just laid out, I think half of them are going to receive warm, favorable reception at the state level. For example, support for tuition-free community colleges. I think that's a pretty likely issue that will receive support at the state level. And then we also have forgiveness of student loans up to certain income eligibility category. I think that would be quite warmly received by some of the governors, including the Republican governors.
Thank you.
We have questions from Francesca, and then we'll go to Maya.
Hi, my question is more towards the federal involvement in school district bailouts, because I feel like it trickles into teacher preparation and diversifying the teacher workforce, where if a school district just doesn't have the budget in order to sustain itself and its students, and the state reserves are low given the pandemic on top of that. That limits the school district's involvement in a lot of teacher preparation programs in partnerships with higher education programs, but also in partnerships with federal grants meant to support diversifying the teacher workforce. So it's kind of like a domino effect, but it all starts whether or not those school districts will find some relief through the federal government. I'm wondering if you foresee that happening in this administration, or if this is a place where a plan can be put in place so that in the next, maybe 2 to 3 years, that might come into fruition. I don't know. So this is more of like what your thoughts are and like predictions in terms of school district bailouts.
Yeah, so when I look at right now it's President-elect Biden. He was vice president. When he was vice president, he was in charge of the Obama ARA, the American Recovery Reinvestment Act, to deal with the Great Recession in 2009 and 2010. And within that act, there is a substantial bucket called fiscal stabilization funds, and that has been set aside to support education agencies. And I will not be surprised to see that, given his experience, this could be my crystal ball, wishful thinking here, that I will not be surprised that early on in the Biden-Harris administration, they will try to create some kind of you use the word bailout, but maybe in a more positive way, is a reinvestment or kind of a investment or growth fund that would allow state and education, public K-12 education agencies to tap into to stabilize the teacher workforce, number one. As we cannot afford to lay off teachers and social worker and support staff. So to stabilize that employment. And number two is to start addressing the pension crisis, which state by state will be seeing a lot of bankruptcy going forward because of the pension liability. And I think they will try to use some kind of a stabilization strategy to address that. But if they could address both two, and former Superintendent Sulusi knows very well that, those are the funding liability on pension. Eats up a lot of the pie, the fiscal pie, and then the current employment also eats up a lot of the current pie. If the new administration can help state and district address those two very looming crisis, then I think we'll be in reasonably good shape going forward.
Thank you.
Maya?
Hi, Maya.
Like, I don't know, I've been thrown back to UP20. So in the chat, it's just that I feel like we're all ready to move on from Trump, but thinking that Trumpism will just go gentle seems really naive to me.
Jonathan, political science question.
Anti-equity mandate that's been heightened due to his presidency.
Yeah, I think the thing that also ties this to Francesca's question too is the extra sort of gulf that COVID has created. And so we've had retreatment on equity issues. So how would you even characterize the Obama administration? Like if we think about the Trump administration as the strategic inaction regime, I think we should think about the Obama administration. This goes to David's comment too. We should think about kind of the Obama administration as do what is allowed regime. It wasn't a regime that was willing to sort of overstep and do more, even when there was political power to do so. It was sort of a practice of self-constraint out of a respect for, democratic norms. And the problem is there's been a lot of criticism of the left for that kind of response heading into the Biden-Harris administration. And so we'll see. Right now, the base of the Democratic Party isn't so, I think, patient with this more, let's practice self-restraint. I think the Democratic Party on the left is now looking for more aggressive action. The question is, will the Biden administration deliver that? And if you look at the way Biden was elected, was that actually the narrative under which Biden was elected? Was Biden elected to unify, or was Biden elected to sort of champion the Democratic Party? And this is the thing that I think the administration is trying to figure out currently as they decide what their agenda is going to look like. And it's going to be really important, especially for education, because this is an area you don't see major reform. You know, every Elementary Secondary Education Act, No Child Left Behind, these are reauthorizations of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of '65. We actually have not seen major radical federal reform in education policy in sort of modern times. And so that's already the bar. Again, we have, you know, Biden sort of building off of the Obama administration of sort of strategic constraint and restraint. And then you have building off of the Trump administration was, again, strategic inaction. So, you know, it's kind of all of this is a sort of a elevated way of saying, well, let's wait and see. It could go in either direction. And I think it depends on how, again, to Professor Wong's point, how the staff is constructed and what type of agenda is being formulated also out of Congress. And really what happens with these two Senate races in Georgia.
And I might also add that because of the diminishing majority of the House Democratic Party, that there is a very important part of this conversation is to that I think the Biden-Harris is going to ally with the progressive wing of the Democratic Party in a more coherent way. So I think they will try to bring them in as a central player because of the diminishing majority that they have. So and also thousands of communities have voiced their concern through Black Lives Matter movement that there needs to be some systemic change. So in reply to some of the comments in the chat, I think although historically the Democratic Party has been very cautious and very incremental and not really bringing about radical changes, like Jonathan said, you know, 65, the Great Society program many years ago. Now we haven't done much, you know, in recent years. But because of the urban situation that we see through Black Lives Matter movement, as well as the maturing of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and the slimming majority in the House, I think all of these might converge into an opportunity to create a more kind of a systemic approach. Eric, you have a question or comment?
Yes. Well, first, thank you guys both for sharing your insights and comments on this topic. I really enjoy hearing from you both. In a way, I really love how the pandemic has, you know, made the disparities within the educational system more obvious, but obviously not at the expense of already marginalized students. So I wanted to know, how do you two anticipate the Biden-Harris administration working to support increasing federal investment in education and reducing the reliance on local property taxes to address issues like the digital equity gap?
This is a very important question on rethinking the Serrano versus San Antonio Supreme Court decision. And that is because of that decision back in the 1970s that, you know, school funding is really the state responsibility and, you know, the federal government has nothing to do with it. I think it is the time now. And if I'm just, again, look at the crystal ball in a more optimistic way, that the Biden-Harris administration may be in a good position to leverage a compelling argument and a coalition with some of the stakeholders to really revisit this whole notion of education funding responsibility, whether it should entirely rely on local property tax or state income tax. But then, you know, rethink this notion that this is a national public good. This is a national responsibility rather than a state and local fiscal responsibility. So that's, we may be seeing, I I would anticipate that there will be some conversation along that line in the next few years.
Well, I think, well, we're out of questions and out of time. Thank you everyone for attending this event. Congratulations, Professor Wong, on the completion of another book. It was an exciting read. I love the way you put the Obama administration into context before sort of launching into what's happening with education policy under the Trump administration. I learned a lot specifically just about how executive orders work and all the other sort of levers that presidents can pull in order to be engaged in policy related action. And so thank you for this text and thank you for your work. And thank you to everyone who showed up. I hope you took something enlightening away from the conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Great to see UEP 22.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks, Jonathan, for moderating this very important conversation. Thanks. Bye-bye.